speakers. Now, our first speaker, well, in fact, probably all of them don't really need an introduction, but in case they do, I will, if you don't mind, particularly within the case of Peter, I'm going to read the introduction because it's quite long, Peter, and I, you know, one could actually abbreviate it for time, and I'm not going to do that because if to do this would actually not present to everyone what truly is a magnificent contribution to the field of planning, transportation and environmental development Peter has made. So I'm going to make no apology, Peter, you hope you don't get too embarrassed. I'm going to run through a little bit of his achievements. That may make us a little bit impressed after we've read them in relation to what we've achieved all. Bartlett Professor of Planning and Regeneration at the Bartlett School of Planning, University College, and Senior Research Fellow at the Young Foundation, formerly the Institute of Community Studies, of which at one time he was a director from 2001 to 2004. He has, as you are probably well aware, an interest in the application of research to planning and regeneration policy with special reference to transport and urban development. He is author, correct me if I'm wrong, I haven't given this information, I didn't do the research, of 40 books, is that right, Julie? 40 books on urban and regional planning and related topics. He has received the Founders Medal of the Royal Geographical Society for distinction in research and is an honorary member of the Royal Town Planning Institute and honorary fellow of the Royal Institute of British Architects. That's quite an achievement, by the way, for a geographer to become a member of the Institute of British Architects. He is a fellow of the British Academy and member of the Academia Europaea. He holds 14 honorary doctorates. If you go to his room, you will see them on the wall. You don't need wallpaper. He holds 14 honorary doctorates from universities in the UK, Sweden, and Canada. He was knighted in 1998 for services to the Town and Country Planning Association, and in 2003 he seems to be a regular visitor to the Buckingham Palace, was named by Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth as a pioneer in the life of the nation at a reception at Buckingham Palace. In 2003, you can see what I mean by being long. In 2003, he received the Gold Medal of the Royal Town Planning Institute, the first to be awarded for 20 years. In 2005, he was awarded a Lifetime Achievement Award by the Deputy Prime Minister for his contributions to urban regeneration planning, and he received the 2005 Balzan Prize for his work on social and cultural history of cities since the beginning of the 16th century. In 2008, he received the Sir Patrick Abercrombie Prize for the International Union of Architects. Now, I'm going to stop there. There's far more, but you can read it yourself. The particular piece of work that Peter, I've asked Peter to revisit is a piece of work which was done in 1980. The Football planning disaster. Some of you may know this. What this work presents, unfortunately, is how knowledge has been around for a long time and actually hasn't been taken up. So I think one of the messages that I take from this is let's not look for new knowledge, but let's look at the knowledge we've already accumulated in the past. Don't let it sort of die away with time. So Peter is going to give a presentation now of the topic of planning disaster revisit.
Thank you, Harry. Thank you, Harry, and good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and to all of you who come from outside to London, welcome to UCL. And I see many old friends in the audience. Nice to see you again. Harry, as you know, when you asked me first to give this talk, I demurred on the grounds that it was a 33-year-old book, and probably most people had read it at some time in their lives, probably as students, and they probably didn't need to be reminded of it again. But you persuaded me that there perhaps were some lessons which we might pick up in a discussion. So what I'd like to do is give a very brief presentation of the main themes of that old book, and ask particularly what it might have to tell us in this year 2013. The book had a sensational, even a sensationalist title, but I think you can argue that the terms were precise. Great has to do with major planning decisions that involve a lot of money. Planning had to do with not the physical planning, as we sometimes define it in planning schools, but the general sequence of operations found in textbooks of planning, but also in management. And disasters, this is the important word in the book, really come in two varieties. One, positive, something that happened that many people said it shouldn't have happened. And secondly, more complex, negative. That is a decision not to do something that then produces a messy unwillingness to take any decision at all. And I should say we tended to be rather good at that second kind of disaster in this country over many years. So examples in the book: positive disasters, the Concorde airplane, which is now no more, the Sydney Opera House, which is very much there, and many people, importantly, would say is perfectly okay, though much criticised, the San Francisco BART system, Severo is in the audience, and many motorway systems in many cities. But beware that apart from Concorde, these artifacts survive, and they've been re-evaluated, and some of them, at least, that seemed not so good, now seem a lot better. The negative disasters, more complex. At the time of the writing, with the third London airport, which actually has happened at Stansted, because ironically a year after the book was published, there was a major public inquiry which gave the go-ahead to Stansted, and it's even possible, we may want to come back to this, that Stansted may yet become the first London airport because it's in the frame of the inquiry now commissioned by this government for the future of a major hub airport for London, which might even replace Heathrow. That's an interesting one, isn't it? The planned London motorway system, most of which never got built, fragments of it do, rather forlornly sitting in the landscape of London. And interestingly, perhaps most interestingly of all, the British Library, which then appeared a total disaster, no decision taken, but lo and behold, a decision was taken shortly after the book was published, no causal connection, to locate the library in next to the St Pancras station. And so you could say, if you like, French-type puns, that in London the TGV is next door to the TGB. And a very successful juxtaposition it is, although I doubt that many Eurostar customers directly go into the BL. And then there's another one which becomes more interesting, a near disaster, where a good decision gets made in the nick of time. One was the plan for new campuses of the University of California in the 1960s under the great California Governor Pat Brown, father, it should be said, of the current California Governor Jerry Brown, and, as I've mentioned already, the plan for the new British Library. And both those got resolved satisfactorily, and we have those new California campuses at places like Santa Cruz and San Diego, and we have the new British Library, but only after a lot of going around in circles. Now, let me now zoom straight in to some of the key conclusions about things that went wrong. And this is central, I think, to what we'll be talking about. In the case of the things that did get built and were criticised, one of the underlying criticisms, which really tells, is that is actually estimation of both demand for the product and also the cost of the product. In the case of the Channel Tunnel Rail Link, now renamed High Speed 1, some of you have possibly come from mainland Europe on the Eurostar yesterday. The actual estimates of passenger numbers 20 years ago, when the decision was taken to build the line, were actually far in excess of actual figures. In fact, the figures are actually worse than less than 50%. They're only around 1/3 what they should be at this point. Something went very wrong with that estimate. And in other cases, which you can find in the book, in the most disastrous cases, only 10% of the actual forecast was realised. I could talk more about why the High Speed 1 estimates went wrong, but perhaps we'll pick it up in discussion. Costs are another area. Concorde was a pretty good one, 150, 175 million, goes to 2,000 million. The Epic was the Sydney Opera House, which started at 7 million Australian dollars and finished at 102 million. Sorry, that should be dollars, not pounds. And a very interesting study made years ago by a Berkeley professor, Leonard Meredith, showed that there was an average cost escalation of around 55% in all civil engineering projects. And we now have the extremely important work of Ben Cleveberg, which came after my book, and he has shown in much more detail just how wrong many of these estimates are. And Ben Cleveberg, who's a blunt Danish professor now at Oxford, uses the word lying. He says consultants lie about the figures, and they know that they are feeding junk out to the decision makers because that's what the people who commission them want to hear. That's something pretty outrageous, but you may want to pick it up in the discussion. Now, deepening this debate, a very important book published even longer ago than mine by Friend and Jessup, Local Government Strategic Choice, 1969, just been republished, by the way. In looking at these issues, they focus on three kinds of uncertainty in this kind of forecasting. One they call uncertainty in the relevant planning environment, e.g. demography and economic growth. And we've seen over the last 60 years how our population forecasting in this country has gone wildly, crazily wrong. Ken Livingston, our former mayor, has just come in, and Ken, you will know that we've all been shocked by the latest figures from the 2011 census showing that London's population rose by 1 million in the last 10 years, and everyone's saying, what were these 1 million people? Where did they get here? And the demographers got it wrong. Likewise with economic growth. Anyone who reads the financial pages will know the melancholy story here. I was just on the tube coming in reading the latest French story, a real tale of woe, where all the economic growth forecasts are being wrapped down and down. And by the way, there's something I'll put in here. I mean, one of the real issues, I think, now is that everyone is discussing double-dip recessions, triple-dip recessions. Supposing the current slowing down is not a recession at all, but is something much more structural and longer term, which is a decline in the long-term growth prospects of the economies of the advanced world, which I'm increasingly inclined to believe is possibly the truth, although it may be overlaid by cyclical phenomena. And we can look back at the experience of the 1930s in that respect. A second kind of uncertainty is uncertainty about related decision areas, e.g. transport policies will impinge on development and land use. We are investing, and Ken had a great deal to do with this, in our biggest ever civil engineering project, Crossrail. They're tunnelling under Oxford Street now as I speak, and the line will be opened in 2018. That is going to have profound effects on the geography of London. We're pretty certain that Crossrail will be finished in 2018, but we have other areas. Our big debate at present is on what we call High Speed 2, a huge new high-speed network connecting London to the Midlands and north of England. Probably it will all be here by 2032, but it might not be there by 2032. And what if it isn't? A major effect on the prospects of the major cities of the Midlands and North. But perhaps most profound is uncertainty about the value systems of relevant actors. And here, there's a lot in the book about this. There have been absolutely major shifts in attitude. The biggest, I think, occurring about 40 years ago in the early 70s, was changes in our basic attitudes to transport planning, urban renewal, and a lot else. We had a huge decision to abandon a major redevelopment of our Covent Garden area. We abandoned the motorway plan in 1973. Paris rebuilt the markets, but regretted it. Stockholm had a major debate over the future of its central business district, Lower Norrmalm. And there were huge changes in the way we pursued policies. One of the most important, by the way, in the transport area is that in the 60s we happily believed in predict and provide to handle the clear rising trend in car ownership. We abandoned that, although there was a brief lurch back under the late Margaret Thatcher in the 80s. We have generally moved steadily away from predict and provide and more towards restrictions on the free use of the car. And very important research which has come out of UCL in recent months in conjunction with Imperial College is about the phenomenon of peak car. A huge debate taking place here on whether car use has actually peaked or not. The new research suggests that it hasn't, it's probably flattened, but it's certainly going down a lot in London, and that may be because we have developed a really excellent and very efficient and well-operating public transport system. And again, Ken sitting here should claim some of the credit for that. Many of the UE problems are actually, you can suggest, really changes in the related areas and also related value systems. Let me give you one very up-to-date example. We are pursuing High Speed 2 because one of the most phenomenal changes in transport planning in the last 30 years has been the renaissance of rail. First of all in Japan, then in countries like Taiwan and Korea, and then on a huge scale here in Europe, with a growing network of high-speed train services, which were really unimaginable 30 years ago, and accompanied by a huge increase in rail travel, which was totally off the charts, again, when I wrote Great Planning Disasters. Will this continue? All the huge investment in High Speed 2 is positive on us running out of capacity on the existing railway system sometime in the 2020s. If that didn't happen, if we reached peak rail rather than peak car, then we might have a real issue. And that's important for many areas in the world. China has, as everyone knows, invested hugely in high-speed rail, and And even, dare I say it, the United States is just about to catch up, Bob, because Governor Jerry Brown has turned the tap on, and you're at last laying the rails of the California high-speed system in the Central Valley. Now, moving on, because I'm conscious of the clock, if you actually apply the theory, particularly to these changes in values, and also to what's happening in the planning environment, we find critically that there are three key groups. This, Harry, picks up your point about politics and its importance. First of all, you've got the community, any group of individuals that has a stake in the decision and wants to influence it. In fact, many communities exist, and we can belong to more than one. My favourite instance, and it does occur, is the person who works in an office in some city planning new transport investment, be it a new motorway or a new high-speed line, and then goes home in the evening and joins a group to oppose some investment, possibly even the same investment, but that would be a bit too Machiavellian. We can see that communities' main concern, and this is evidenced in the literature I quote in the second half of the book, is to avoid losses, in a technical term, to their existing level of welfare. Those of you from Britain will know that the debate on High Speed 2 has been absolutely dominated by people who write letters to the papers, a disproportionate number of whom seem to come from Great Missenden and Little Missenden. These names will not mean much to those of you from abroad, but they happen to be places next to the high-speed line in a very nice part of the Chiltern Hills and north of London. And they have had a quite disproportionate influence on the debate. You say good luck to them. They're vociferous and they're well organised, and they know how to write letters to papers or to blog or tweet. Secondly, you have the group we can call the bureaucrats, including the technocrats. And what you find if you break it down is there are many bureaucracies, even within the same government, who are generally at war with each other, except that the war is generally papered over by a lack of freedom of information. In particular, Treasury departments everywhere fight all the other departments over money. And interestingly, with more open government in this country, we are seeing this more and more visible every day in the media. Very many of these departments actually ally with community lobbies. So a transport department can ally with the interest groups outside, be these commercial or simply public interest groups who support a particular agenda, be it, again, motorways or high-speed rail. The politicians are in the middle, and they're mediating between the demands of conflicting groups and the vested interests in the bureaucracies. And one quote I very much like, which comes somewhere in the book, and I forget who I was quoting from, where, quote, "The people are out in the streets, and I must follow them because I am their leader." Sometimes you feel that, looking at the present government's U-turns, that's a very apposite quotation. And we owe a great deal here to a great American economist who died very recently, James Buchanan of George Mason University in Virginia, who developed, very importantly in the 60s and 70s, the theory which gave him the Nobel Prize in Economics, public choice theory. He argued that in democracies, politicians buy votes, not by open bribery, of course they do that occasionally too, but by marketing packages of goods with certain price tags to the public. Their problem, the public's problem, is that the ballot box is a very rough approximation to a market. It's as if commercial companies said, you can have a Volvo car and you can have an apartment in central London, And another company says, well, we can offer you a smaller Ford Focus car and a very big house in the country, and maybe throw in some groceries and so on. The point is, these are packages which don't respond to what people would buy, given free choice in a market. So he argued that intensities of preference matter a lot. And what he calls coalitions of passionate minorities tend to get their agendas adopted. Whether these are very well organised groups with a political agenda which people don't recognise at first, or whether they're simply people who want to stop something happening, like those people in Great and Little Missenden. And by the way, I should just say that, having been part of this, one reason we have High Speed 2 is, as a project, it is due to the activities of a very small group of people. Not many people have ever heard of them. They're called Greengage 21, and I happen to have been a member of their advisory group for about 6 or 7 years. Very well organised by a brilliant transport consultant, Jim Steer, and finally, therefore, we persuaded government that high-speed rail was a good idea for this country. So that's an example of a very small, passionate minority, or that included a number of key people in the railway industry, getting a positive agenda versus those people in Great and Little Missenden who very much want to stop the result happening. So the result, Buchanan argued, is there's a tendency to maintain the status quo, but new issues will emerge with new bureaucracies forming to campaign them, sometimes with changes in government structure and with new interest groups. And politicians may well support what seem like sexy projects until big hidden costs emerge, where both money costs and also political costs, where they may get very nervous. It's very interesting, by the way, I keep talking High Speed 2, but one lovely thing about High Speed 2 for politicians, including the present government, is it's going to happen a long time in the future. Stage 1, 2026, Stage 2, 2032. So it's not going to happen in this government, it's not going to become a big issue at the next general election in 2015. It's going to become a much bigger issue in years and even decades to come. Very nice for politicians because it sounds good, but without any immediate costs apart from some consultancy costs. So where do we go from here? Following Buchanan, you can get what you could call a pathological decision-making process, a weakness of politicians for big, new, superficially attractive projects or programs. The Sydney Opera House was a marvellous example of that, because it seemed a good idea at the time. And by the way, it wasn't too bad because it was paid for by a lottery and the taxpayer didn't pay. Then you can get new bureaucracies forming, or sub-bureaucracies in departments, in government departments, which will support such programs, with a resulting tendency, in many cases, to cost escalation, as the original estimates proved to be very poorly worked out, hardly worked out at all, and the hidden costs begin to emerge. Particularly as difficulties emerge politically, cause adaptation, and I might say, look at all those tunnels that have been added to the High Speed 2 project, one of them actually in Little Missenden. There is also, however, the ability of really established bureaucracies to resist pressure for policy change, particularly the Treasury Department. But there's finally, and very apposite in this country, the puzzling tendency of some decisions to keep recycling without resolution. It may be that we've progressed since I published the book 33 years ago. I think we are better in this country at going through with schemes, even when they may prove to have difficulties on the way, than we were in the 70s. And I have to say that I did write that book at the end of perhaps one of the worst decades in post-war British history, a decade of strife and economic decline in which government seemed to completely lose its nerve until the arrival of a rather notable lady who died yesterday. I'm going to skip this bit because it discusses whether Marxist analysis, so fashionable in the 1980s, it is one way of analysing these issues. And I come to the conclusion that it can be very interesting, but it needs a considerable sophistication of the original Marxist hypothesis of a disaffected proletariat. One interesting example, though, of public choice theory is what the American political scientist calls growth coalitions, a term invented by John Mollenkopf. These are groups of people in favour of big projects, such as Crossrail, High Speed 2, a third runway at Heathrow, or the alternative, a Thames Hub airport. Again, these are passionate minorities. They're people who spend a lot of time thinking about these issues and devising solutions, often led by business interests, but also including academics who have to persuade themselves, each other, that there is a good argument for the project. Consider some of the arguments being deployed here in the great debate on airport capacity. London airports are losing out to mainland European airports, such as Frankfurt, Schiphol and Charles de Gaulle, who are offering a greater variety of direct flights to Chinese cities. Or High Speed 2 is needed to rebalance the UK economy and start the economy of the northern English cities growing again. These are almost presented as slogans, and the real issue is what is behind the slogans. Often, by the way, they are not well worked out, at least in the early stages. A key issue that I was concluding about in the book and is now very much reappeared in this era of austerity and state-led expenditure cuts, the limits of state action. Why should the state finance and build urban transport projects, airport projects, highway projects or rail projects? Why not simply leave it to the private sector and then pursue income distribution policies? Or could you, or should you go for a mixture of regulation and pricing, e.g. congestion charging in Singapore and now in London? By the way, I got an email yesterday from a correspondent in Singapore who said we're considering privatising and franchising our bus systems, as you've done it in London. What do you think about it? And I said I thought it would work excellently in London, and we had a brilliant bus system. Ken could claim some credit again, and compared with a pretty awful bus system in which we did owe to Margaret Thatcher in the deregulated regime in the rest of this country. So it seems that even Singapore, which we often extol as a pioneer in applying pricing to planning decisions, is still trying to fine-tune its system. So finally, how to improve the planning system? Well, first of all, improve the quality of forecasts. Amazing how bad they still are. Second, focus on those three areas, but especially changes in values. And particularly try to second-guess what I'll call in some rather highfalutin language, intergenerational dialectic. The idea that each generation reacts against its parents. So the children of suburbia grow up there and say, we hate suburbia and we all want to live in the city. And some evidence of that, interestingly, in America, where in the Brookings Institution, they discovered that last year, for the first time, American central cities grew faster than suburbs. Is this a huge change in the way Americans are going to live, and will that actually spread here to Europe? Greatly sophisticate and rehabilitate cost-benefit analysis, but above all, try to disaggregate the costs and benefits to different groups, and particularly spend more attention on those things which are difficult or even impossible to quantify in money terms. And adopting this is a bit controversial, so I'm going to almost finish. Adopt an incremental planning style. Do what needs to be done now and leave the rest for later. But you can't build half a high-speed train system, or can you? So the big question is when to make the big break and say there's something big here, whether it's a new London airport or a new train system, and when to say time to stop dithering, let's go for it. And that's the biggest issue of all, to which we should go back to Friend and Jessup, and said at the beginning that a brilliant but lately neglected book was finally reprinted last year, and the great Buchanan and Tulloch tome on public choice theory is still in print. I can recommend both to you. That's time to stop, I think, Harry, and hand over to Ken. Thank you.